Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think they've brought a few of us out of cold storage to talk a little bit about the history of ARFTG and what's been going on. What I'm going to try to do is give you kind of an idea of how ARFTG started and how it's evolved during that period of time. And then Kevin's going to talk about kind of the technologies that got covered, and Ron's going to talk about where we might be going. So anyways, Ken's kind of done an introduction already, so why don't we move on. The 8540 was essentially what kicked everything off. It was a product brought out by Hewlett Packard in about '69, and it was essentially originally a demonstration product to show the automation of instrumentation. HP had just created a computer, a mini computer, or whatever you want to call it, and it wanted to demonstrate something about it. It was probably a little surprised by the interest that there was actually in the marketplace for it. It was a pretty rudimentary system. It was based on the 8410, and it had a computer that had, depending on which version you had, a whopping 8K words, not 8 meg words or 8 giga words, 8K words. I think your average garage door opener had more intelligence now than what that machine had in its past. There was some, if given enough time to talk about some interesting stories of using this instrument. The thing is it was pricey. It started at 200 plus K. Many of the systems were over 300K. In today's dollars, that's $1 million to $2 million. These were pretty pricey systems, but there was a huge unmet need out there that these things sold very quickly and got distributed into industry very widely. There were a series of other versions of it, 8542, 8545, et cetera, that came after this over kind of the next 10-year period. There was also in '71 something called the 8580. Kind of, well, if it worked for network analyzers, let's do it for spectrum analyzers also. The 8580 didn't quite take off as well as the 8540 did, though in a lot of very, very, very deep secret government installations, 8580 was a very key part of what they did. But that's still a fairly dark history at the moment. So this came out, people started buying it, and essentially what happened is a group decided to get together in September of 1971 to start talking about a users group, doing something together. The instigators of this group was a guy named Al Holly, Alvin Wilson, Al Rosenzweig, Ed Stevens. These were essentially the fathers of the group. It started as a users group to kind of lobby Hewlett Packard. And lobby was probably a kind word for that. By the second or third meeting, it was more of a group to get together to explain to HP what the users really needed. And some of the early meetings got a little heated, and it was some interesting times, the relationship at that point. One of the key issues had to do with access to the source code. As one can imagine, source code, if you wanted to do something, you had to get to the source code. You had to be able to change it. So either you had to request the change and get someone to do it, which of course was something, well, we might be able to do that in a few years, or give us the source code. So that was really the point of contention. And as I'll show, it went downhill from there. The attendees were primarily 8540 owners, which by this time there was like 30 or 40 of them, and third-party support companies. And believe it or not, there were a fair amount of third-party support company already within a couple of years. There was a couple of companies, one in particular, what Al set up, was a company that did contract measurements. You would send them your device, and they'd send you back results, 2 or 3 weeks later. And there was 2 or 3 of those companies that set up fairly quickly, that invested a lot of capital, bought one of these things, and started selling time on it. Second meeting was in the New York area. Tensions kind of rose further when HP announced bundled closed hardware-software combinations, that it wasn't going to support anyone writing their own code for doing this. At about the same time, non-HP instrument manufacturers started showing up and coming by. And very quickly, and this is part of what I meant about the evolution, very quickly this evolved from just not an HP users group to at least some discussions, though not as popular in the, for quite a few years, by various other manufacturers. So the group very quickly broadened out. The first steering committee was elected. Alvin, Al, and John, and Ed were elected for that. And I've put the names of their companies next to this. And one of the things and I'll talk a little bit about that later, companies, a lot of names you don't really associate anymore with this or in here, such as like Westinghouse. But, and there was another thing that kind of started about this time, the semi-tradition of HP sending a different representative to every meeting. Internally, it was a little bit of a joke. You only had to sacrifice yourself once to come to this meeting. And someone else would come next. It wasn't until the third meeting, September, that the name Automatic RF Techniques Group was adopted. There was bylaws, 81 folks in attendance. Wait a second. Yeah. That's 72. I just realized there's a typo there. First meeting was in 72. By this time, there was 81 in attendance, which is about what's here. And it's kind of interesting. ARFTG historically has been around 80 to 100 people over the entire 40-year period. It's gotten a little above that, a little below that, but it's always been kind of that size group, which is part of its unique character. The other thing that's kind of interesting is the discussion topics at this third meeting essentially would sound very familiar to what's been discussed today. Calibration, verification, interface connector issues, cables, time domain, CAD, and CAE. Those were the topics then, and they're still the topics now. It's really kind of interesting, about that. There was another kind of first at this meeting, and for those that had been around for a long time, you will all remember Harold Steinhelfer, who was first with Microwave Associates and then made it. And he made his first of many time domain transformation presentations. And that's a few years ago. Harold still held the record for the most presentations. I'm pretty sure it's still true. It was somewhere around 30 or 35 presentations that he's made to the group. There was a lot of unique things about Harold. He was quite a guy, and he was an amateur or a fairly accomplished magician. And he used to do magic tricks all the time, and particularly at the banquets and things like that, and particularly for the spouses. So he was one of the many characters. And just as a side note, when I got started preparing this, I really did get nostalgic going over and looking at these names and people that I had, associated with myself for over 20-some-odd years. And there were some really great people there, and I think that's one of the great things about this group, is you really get to know each other quite well. There was another tradition that started about this time, that was the host tour. Not doing that so much anymore now, but it used to be that every location we would go for a meeting. Friday afternoon would be a tour of the host's place of employment. And that was quite a nice place, a nice thing to do. Things got really sticky, especially after 9/11, and even before that, security things were getting really hard to do, to be able to do that. But while that was going on, and got to see the inside of a lot of places. Okay, I'm not going to talk about every meeting. There's a reference at the end that gives you a lot more detail, especially about the first 20 or so. But one of the things happened is the first 4 occurred in conjunction with other events, but soon ARFTG started having its own meetings. And that's part, again, the evolution. It was being able to start meeting on its own. It started doing things like in '75, the traveling kit experiment, a verification kit, so that we could do accuracy studies. And that kit probably been to more countries than most of us have been to. But it would go to essentially almost every national standards laboratory in the world. And there was traceability, it was a traceable kit, and we had data from a lot of other groups and getting a good idea of what's going on. And every so often there'd be a really oddball data coming in, and people would be very quick to trying to make sure it wasn't identified with them. So who collected the data was kept a little quiet. 76, dues were adopted. 77 is a technology thing, but it's only one I've got really in here. But I mention it because that's when the ASCII bus, or later the IEEE 48 bus, started showing up. And all of a sudden, instead of being essentially systems from HP or Aeroflex or other companies like that, there started being custom systems in there. And that brought a kind of a different group in and a little different tenure to the group. In '81, a grand friend of many of us, Mari, got into leadership roles and started adding a lot of really significant things to ARFTG, an awards system, a digest, a post-conference digest at that time. But it started formalizing things. There was a lot of opposition originally, because this was really kind of a workshop, user group type environment. But once people got a little more comfortable with it, and we got very lenient about what we accepted as publishable papers in the sense of format and things like that. Finally, the 19th conference, we started doing conference papers, and that's one of the, where Mario pulled me in to start actually doing work at the XCOM level and things like that. In '85, exhibits, reoccurring exhibits started. Vendor talks and vendor presentations have always been part of this, but it got more formalized at that point. '86, a grand gentleman, Bob Nelson, became our first executive secretary. He epitomized the word gentleman. He was a great guy. '94, the short course type that occurred a couple of days ago started. That was organized by Bob Judish, who was, one of the things, Bob wasn't an engineer, he was a statistician. But because of his role at the Bureau and his activities, he became a very active part of ARFTG. 94, we started poster sessions. 98, we announced student fellowships and grants. 2001, incorporated as a not-for-profit. So I think you can see quite an evolution occurring the group as it starts from its original basis of just kind of a few folks getting around the table and having a talk to something a little more organized and with a little more depth and breadth. One of the things that started at this time was the association with MTTS. And there was a number of folks that played both sides of the fence on this one. in particular George Oltman, another great guy, who also working with Lee Saulsbury, another person from the Bureau, and I still call it the Bureau, and I think at that time it was still the Bureau. It was still NBS at that time, but NIST at that. But those were two strong leaders in this group, and they started figuring out how to work. 79, we had the first joint activity in Orlando as a workshop, and in 80 became a more formal linkage with IMS and created a formal role on the MTTS AdCom for ARFTG liaison. 81, ARFTG was set up as a technical committee. 87, transitioned to an MTTS-sponsored conference. And 87, 2000, and 2012, MOUs have evolved during this period of time. So you can see that's been 25 years of association with that. But the key thing is that ARFTG is a separate professional organization, but it has very close ties to MTTS and IMS. Now, there's a whole bunch of folks just going through the slides you were seeing earlier with pictures of some of the early meetings, but these are many of the folks. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but one of the things is to look at the different number of companies involved here and the roles of some of those. A couple of people real quickly, Al Rosenzweig, who was one of the real initial founders. I found if I finally understood what Al was saying, it actually made sense. But sometimes to figure out what he was saying was a little tricky. But he had a very unique perspective, and he was a very energetic guy. There was Bill Pastore, Mr. Noise, just another fabulous guy who knew everything about noise. There was Barry Perlman. Barry represented something that unfortunately there isn't very much of anymore. It was a corporate lab. He worked out of Sarnoff Labs, RCA. And a lot of these instruments originally went into the corporate labs. And that's how Westinghouse and GE and various other places. But those places don't exist anymore. And it's a real shame and something we lost, and some really great folks. Jim Taylor, who's long been associated, was another great person in those early days. There was Dorian Gray, Gary Simpson, who looks exactly, almost, a little bit grayer the last couple of years, but not that much change. This was something you've never seen at an IEEE event. This is the president of ARFTG at the honor ceremony in a toga at Las Vegas. And that's kind of one of the neat things. This group never takes itself too seriously. You'd never see that at a formal IEEE event. But Ray, who's quite a character himself, and actually predates me a couple of years in joining with ARFTG, did the whole award ceremony. We were at Caesar's Palace. That may help explain the toga. There was also the guy that basically became HP to this organization. That was Jim Fitzpatrick. He was the one guy that was willing to come every year and stick it out. He started around the third or fourth meeting. And Jim was one of those folks I worked with for many years and learned a great deal from him. There was another person, Doug Ridding, who really wasn't in the early days, but he's been a really big part of forming this organization. And if nothing else he did, he was the one that supported me so that I could be part of this organization in those early days. So those are some folks I wanted to say a little more about. One of the things is groups inspired by ARFTG. A number of groups have not spun off, but were inspired by ARFTG and set up very similar models. And the first of that was AMTA, or the Automated Measurements, Antenna Measurements Group. I actually attended that meeting for many years myself because it made some business sense to do that. And There was also ARMS, essentially the UK branch of this that was set up for years, and I think it's still actually going on and active. But those two groups that basically looking at ARFTG said, we want to do something just like what you did. And they're pretty much structured in a similar way. So the evolution of ARFTG started off as a users group, really transformed itself into a conference, and now is a professional association of 40 years. And if you want any more history, a lot more details, the first two references are readily available. One on the ARFTG site, one on the IEEE site. And the following two are essentially Agilent HP items that cover the history of a lot of the instruments. And I want to point out that Jim Taylor was the source of the photos that I've used and we showed earlier. So that's kind of how ARFTG started and evolved into what you are today. And you're still evolving.